What I want to do, though, is give you guys the right tools and just allow you guys to begin from somewhere better than what I see a lot of Marxists on YouTube are trying to begin you with. Because a lot of Marxists on YouTube, when they're telling you that, well, class means power over the workplace. Communism is moneyless, classless society. That's the meaning of communism. It's a definition. You know, they're making you begin from a bad place. I want you guys to begin from a better place and be able to discover things better on your own. Open up more channels, because they're really closing a lot of doors on you when they're having you begin with that. I promised I was going to have a little short stream about class, because I think this is something that is continually misunderstood in America and Britain and other English-speaking countries, as far as I'm concerned, countries where the language I can understand, specifically in the West, doesn't seem like people have a good understanding of what class is. And if you're active on a shithole site called Twitter, there's all sorts of debates. What's up, Bruno? Glad to see you here, man. There's all sorts of stupid fucking debates that are going on about class reductionism versus identity politics, race versus class, and then, worst of all, you have intersectionality. And intersectionality is not really something I've seen Marxists, even the ones I would consider myself sympathetic to, really address and be able to, overcome. It seems like implicitly everybody's a kind of intersectional. So, well, class is important, but other things are important too. It's a really undialectical view because it doesn't situate what class is. But the guy named Hugo Pink, I've seen one of his videos. I'm not too familiar with the guy, but as I was watching one of his videos, he said something that is repeated often on BreadTube, and I was kind of surprised to see him say it. He said he implied basically that class was defined by your ability to fire people and the power you have in the workplace and the ability to have that kind of control. Well, actually, that's not a materialistic definition or view of class. That's actually a political definition of class, right? Politics is about what? Politics is a thing that's about sovereignty and power and control and all that kind of stuff. And we've been seeing in the West that there's this influx of, I think Caleb calls it postmodernism. It kind of traces to a French thinker called Foucault, who replaced the Marxist class analysis, the materialistic analysis, with an analysis that was fixated on power and relationships of power. And power was the supreme thing. Not material relations of production, but power, control, domination, and so on and so on. So it's kind of concerning to see that there's Marxist-Leninists out there, or people adjacent to our tanky sphere, who are kind of concurring with that Americanization of the class analysis. Class is actually not defined by the power you have in the workplace and your ability to influence decision-making and all that kind of stuff. That's more of a political and cultural type of thing. It has actually nothing to do with, well, everything has something to do with everything. That's a dialectical view. But that's actually not how Marxists in the past have defined or understood what class is. Class is not political, it's economic. You can talk about the political and cultural implications of that, that's fine. And among those, maybe include the tremendous, deciding power that bosses have over workers, but that's actually not what defines what the class is. Yeah, you hear some more populist right conservatives like Sagar Enjeti, I don't know who that is, talking about the managerial elite. Well, that is a thing, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily the same thing technically as the class as Marx was understanding it. But you can easily see that there is a professional managerial elite that can be understood as a definite social formation in our society. But it's not technically what a class is in Marxism. And what a class is, I'm going to get to really quick. And it's so simple, guys, it's going to blow your mind. Trying to vaguely sound like they're talking about class when the managers still work for Capital 2. Ewok, that's a very interesting point, because according to the dogmatic West Marxist view, actually CEOs are the working class because they don't actually technically own the means of production. They too are employees who are hired. I've seen that as a libertarian talking point, and people tend to just dismiss it as that, but I haven't seen a good response to that argument, and it's actually a completely valid argument. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no difference between CEOs and the average Joe in America. What it means is that Western Marxists need to go back to the basics and really reevaluate what they're taking for granted, because the way they've responded to that is by saying, well, CEOs have more power, but actually power is not what defines classes and class relations. Specifically, you can still have a coherent understanding of the social differences and the class struggle in the United States between the professional managerials and the people, but you need to get your theory correct first, and then it'll be all clear what we're dealing with. What is a peasantry? What is the proletariat? What is the people, the populist people, right? What is the professional managerial class? What is the metropolitan petite bourgeoisie? Why is there somehow a difference between city proletariat and rural proletariat? You know what I'm saying? So this is really something that's multi-dimensional that we're dealing with, but if we can square off a correct understanding of class, it'll enable us to make sense of all of these other really complicated things, including what's addressed by so-called intersectionality, which is race. Well, what about race? Isn't race just as important as class? But they're different things is the thing. You have to understand what class is first, and then it'll be clear why there's a racial antagonism and all this kind of stuff, anti-imperialism and so on and so on. The first thing I want to do is I want to give you guys a brief historical background about the origin of the significance of class, specifically in the 19th century. The question I'm throwing out there for you guys to think about is, what is the origin of the concept of class? Because the general concept of class has its origin with Marx, or not necessarily Marx, but in the 19th century. Before the 19th century, there were castes and social distinctions of all sorts in all civilizations. But there was never a general concept of a class. If you wanted to talk about class, you were going to be talking about particular classes. If you lived in the feudalism, right, you're talking about knights and nobles and all that kind of bullshit, and you're just talking about the particular classes. You're not talking about class in general. So the thing we want to think about is, how did class in general arise, okay? That's the most important thing that has to be interrogated if we want to arrive at a good understanding of class where we are right now. When the old class structure broke down and people needed to describe, but Mr. D, here's the problem with that, is that class structures have always been broken down and rebuilt and so on across the history of humanity, you know? So that was nothing new. That specifically was nothing new. The ancients did have a concept of social distinctions as a general rule, though. Right, but class in general, right? Class in the abstract, in the sense of Marxism, specifically as it concerns material relations of production and not just explicit political distinctions and rank and so on and so on. So that's the question we have to ask. Answer: perhaps production became a social act, as Engels said. But I would argue, and I think Marx and Engels would argue the same thing, is that production was always social. I mean, from the very beginning of humanity, it was social. Need is the one hitting on the money here, I think. He's quoting, society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, two classes directly facing each other. There's something really significant about that, okay? Two, okay? Just two. In the history of mankind, there is all sorts of social distinctions. Clearly, in our society, there's all sorts of different kinds of social distinctions. But in the modern era, as was described by Marx and Engels, society is splitting up into two great hostile camps. Only two, okay? So we're gonna go ahead and unravel this in a dialectic way. Gonna explain this in a dialectic way. Base neat. We're gonna get to it. Okay, I'm just gonna cut to the chase. The reason why there arose a general concept of class is because of this. It's very simple. Because of the French revolutions, okay, which was itself the culmination of a certain history, the French revolutions, destruction of official distinctions in the sphere of the state and politics, meaning the French Revolution destroyed all state and politically recognized social distinctions. After the French Revolution, from the perspective of the state and the law, everyone was equal. It's what they call bourgeois or formal equality. Some people might object that there still existed discrimination, maybe against minorities or but ultimately, within the polity, the French polity, you guys know what a polity is? A polity is a more general word for a state, but it's more general because a polity can refer to any type of instantiation of political power that encompasses a people. So that's a polity. A polity is just a more general word for a state. I don't really like the word state that much. I prefer polity. It's more specific. If you're a citizen of the French polity, you are an equal, okay? And quite explicitly, this is actually a form of what they call Neoclassicism, okay? Classicism, which began in the Renaissance and was developed through, specifically cultivated as an aesthetic trend and also another kind of trend in England. Remember, the British Empire, I'm kind of schizo all over the place, bear with me here. The British Empire was looking toward Rome, the Roman Empire, as it was considering itself the heir of the Roman Empire, okay? And the cultural, the culture of the French Revolution was very influenced by this history of looking back to ancient Rome as the golden age that was lost from the Middle Ages. So this began in the Renaissance, basically, okay? And within the Roman and Greek, whatever, polities, right, there was this formal equality before the law for citizens. The meaning of a republic, okay, a republic, meant some type of way in which the state recognized everyone, gave everyone political recognition, and premised all members of a polity, okay, as the responsible and civil participants of the state. To put a long story short, guys, after the formal equality of the French Revolution, which made everyone a citizen, okay, who was a part of the polity, the political polity, a citizen of the republic, it could still be observed that there were some kind of social distinction, okay? Some kind of social distinction, some essential social distinction can be observed. Let me go further with this. After the Restoration, if you guys know about that, because I don't want to take anything for granted, after the Restoration, right, and after the defeat of Napoleon, the French monarchy was restored. So the French Revolution became a distant ideal for Europe's intellectuals and thinkers, and the way in which they were responding to their contemporary injustices and antagonisms was looking back to the good old ideals of the French Revolution, namely responding to the injustices and inequalities and all that of the ancien regime and the restored order by Metternich or whatever, was basically looking toward this equality, formal equality, as the model of the future. We want to be equal citizens, no more lords, no more nobles. That was basically the trend, right? Socialism before socialism, more or less. Okay, I'm simplifying a lot of things, but yeah. Proto-socialism, Tova, in the sense that people who would later become socialist intellectuals were first, for example, the English Romantics, they were first looking at the ideals of the French Revolution as basically the way in which they were making sense of the world. Basically, the ideals of the French Revolution, right? The Neoclassicism of the French Revolution, this return to Republican equality, Republican virtue. This was basically the way in which people were expressing this deeper aspiration for some kind of social equality. The main point is that after the Restoration, the intellectuals of Europe, people who were thinking of higher ideals to respond to society's ailments, they were looking at the French Revolution, they were looking at the Republican equality of the citizen as basically the way to respond to society's ills, society's problems. Okay? But so the reason I'm bringing that up is because it's not just that they could observe that social distinctions persisted in spite of the fact that everyone was equal formally. Because even before everyone was formally equal, again, because you have to bear in mind that the French Republic came to an end and the monarchy was restored, people came to the realization, I forget who the author was, but this is the guy who actually brought into being the term proletariat. This is the origin of the term the proletariat. The reason is people could put two and two together about the fact that even on this very abstract level, and this intellectual abstract level, you could deduce arithmetically, right, that even if we are all equal politically, there is some kind of contradiction, some kind of paradox that persists. Nietzsche brought this up with the quote again, society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other. That's the paradox, the antagonism that you could even deduce and arrive at on this abstract intellectual level. If you held as an ideal that the key to society, to solving or responding to society's ailments, lies in the Republican equality of the citizen, you could even deduce in your head why it is that society would split up into two great hostile camps, two great classes directly facing each other. Actually, this is what was happening in England. In England, even before the reforms that would basically create some measure of common social equality as far as the state was concerned, right? That everyone's a citizen with equal rights and so on, the universal suffrage and all those kinds of things. People could perceive that Republican equality of the citizen was not going to be able to respond to this deeper type of antagonism that was happening in society. So guys, pay attention to the quote Nietzsche just shared. Okay? Basically, you have a polity or a nation of some kind. Let's say France. Everyone is an equal citizen. Okay? You have to presuppose this first in order for the essence of class to reveal itself as what Nietzsche described as society splitting up into two great camps. Now, England didn't have formal political equality, and England was the quintessential example of this splitting up into two camps. But it was taken as an article of proof for the romantic ideologists of the French Revolution that, in fact, formal political equality is not actually enough to address or solve this paradox. And in fact, it's the very premise of this paradox, okay? When we are all equal, when we're all politically equal, so to speak, that's actually when class reveals itself, okay? Political equality is what reveals the essence of class. And now I'm going to get to what is class, right? Finally, what this whole stream is about. I'm going to give you a coherent and extremely simple understanding of what class is. Ready? The only way we can arrive at the true essence of class is if we in our heads, even hypothetically as a thought experiment, just assume that everyone is politically equal. Assume that everyone is equal and is free to enter into contractual exchanges with one another rather than exchanges and association that's based in tradition or based in bondage, some kind of forced bondage like serfdom, okay? This is where we see class. This is where class makes itself evident. And this is the reason why, okay? The reason why is very simple. Inevitably, when we're all equal actors selling our goods, there's one good that also needs to be sold, okay? And you know this as labor. But why is that significant? Why does this create such a paradox? Why does this create such an antagonism? Why is it such an antagonism that on the one hand, goods are sold, physical things are sold and exchanged and brought onto the market, and on the other hand, labor is? Why is labor such an important exception? It's very simple. It's a very simple type of arithmetic. It's a very simple you don't need anything complicated to think about why labor is so significant. Ready? Because for all the goods that are going to be exchanged in the market, labor is the condition of possibility of those goods. Labor, abstractly defined, just means the thing that is the source of all those goods. So the paradox of labor as something that becomes sold as a good, similar in the way that you would sell rice and beans and fucking bread and I don't know what else. You know, you'd be a craftsman selling jewels and pottery or whatever you want. The reason why it's so paradoxical that labor itself becomes sold as just another good is because labor is actually the source of all goods. Labor in the abstract, and this is formally true. This is even formally true. When you're paid for you're not paid you're paid for your labor abstractly in wages, in money. Okay, you're paid for your labor abstractly. This is the source of class. Okay, because some people must primarily sell their own labor. Okay, not only their own labor, but labor in general, which they participate in, because remember, labor is social. Some people, the majority of people, at least if we presuppose this pure equality of citizens, some people are going to be selling labor itself, labor which is the source of goods, and some people will only sell goods. Okay? Some people will sell goods and buy labor in order to produce goods, and some people will only be able to sell labor itself. That is the proletariat in the bourgeoisie. You can think of the fact that there's only two classes in this very simple sense. One class has to sell labor, another class sells the product of labor. One class sells labor, one class sells the product of labor. Labor, very simply, refers to the human and social conditions of possibility of the product. This is why it's so paradoxical. I will sell you a jacket, which is the example Marx likes to use in Capital. I will sell you a jacket which crystallizes a certain amount of labor. Some people will sell the labor itself that makes the jacket possible. The conditions of the possibility of products are social and human in nature. Okay, they don't come from nowhere. With the whole question of automation, that's become more complicated, and I'll get to that. But I just want us to all be on the same page about this. Now, I want to get to this, okay? I've talked about what a class is, and I've talked about the premises of a class. The premise of class, right, is political and formal equality. But this political and formal equality is not in the aether, it's not abstract, it's instantiated in a state or a nation. Control of the labor power? No, NEAT. I don't know if you're trolling, NEAT. Do not forget about control, okay? Forget about control. Everybody just focus on this simple fact. We are all equal agents in the marketplace. All of the relations we're entering in with one another are based on contractual equal relationships. It's not about control. It's simply about the fact that some people are selling goods and some people have to sell the very source of those goods, because the source of those goods is social and human in nature. Work is what produces those goods. Now, this whole question of automation and all these confusions, I'll get to. But I want you guys to X out the political element, because when we're introducing politics, we're losing the ball, okay? To understand class, you need to think of politics only abstractly. Yes, it's premised by politics, and I'll get to that, but just assume everyone is equal politically. If you assume that, you're going to arrive at the essence of class. When you start talking about control, this may cover class relations, but it's not actually what's essential, okay? Because even if we're all equal formally as citizens, some inevitable paradox of class is still arising. You made enough... Guys, not to go off on a tangent, but this whole issue with control and domination is actually something based in the information age. What we call the information age. Because with cybernetics, which is a loaded word, with the computer age and the information age, you're dealing with huge structures and systems of scale. So this issue of control and information and feedback, that's why control has become so significant in the way Marxists are presenting class. But they're forgetting the actual origins and history that made this concept necessary and possible. Anyway, just so we're on the same page, right, guys? Condensing what I just said, okay? First, we have something called Political formal equality. Neoclassicist Roman Republican equality of citizens. Presupposing this, which means that all of the relations that we're entering in on the marketplace are based on voluntary and free contracts, contractual association, right? This is liberalism, by the way, more or less liberalism. This is the meaning of liberalism, is this: these relationships are purely defined by explicit, voluntary, and contractual relationships. This is basically liberalism, so that's why it existed in England. Presupposing this, some people are selling goods and some people are selling the very means by which goods are possible, which is labor. And this can even be a hypothetical construction. You can even imagine this and deduce this in your head as just something that makes sense. It doesn't even have to express itself as a real phenomena. You can anticipate the proletariat before the proletariat even exists, just from this basic fact. We have goods. The requirements for the realization of goods are social and human in nature, specifically in the form of labor. Therefore, some people, the only goods that they're going to have is the very conditions of goods possibility, labor. And it's kind of paradoxical because labor is included as just one good among among others, and yet labor is only defined as what you need for goods to be possible. You see what I'm saying? So we're on the same page. Okay, now let me explain to you very simply why our views are heterodox and we diverge from Western Marxism, and we think Western Marxists don't have a dialectical or materialist view of class. Because keep in mind what I just said, and this is where you should have turned something on in your head when I said this. It presupposes formal political republican equality that's based in a polity, that's based in nation. But there's two problems with that. One, this formal equality doesn't exist in the either somewhere. It's instanced in some kind of common political institution, some kind of common polity, some kind of definite, determinate state, some real thing. The French state doesn't exist in the either. It's something that actually exists in reality. And if it actually exists in reality, then its premises are material. It doesn't come from nowhere. So we cannot make the assumption, actually, that everyone is an equal citizen for two very simple reasons. The first reason is that there are different states. Moreover, there are different nations. And nations give rise to states, right? There are different nations and there are different states. And the second most important reason is that even when you consolidate some kind of formal equality, it's always incomplete. I'm going to give you an example of why it's always incomplete. Even when you've created formal equality in the eyes of the state, republican equality that allows all of us to be equal participants in the market, this is never complete. This is never fully consolidated. And the reason is very simple, right? A polity, because a polity is determinate in particular, the way in which it's able to recognize and give recognition to the people over whom it rules is going to be limited. And I'm going to give you France actually as the very example of this. So France is a polity, right? France recognizes all of its people as equal citizens who are free. But here's the problem. Because it is materially limited, because it's determinate in real, the state, the extent of the people living in France who are able to be recognized by the institution of the French state, the polity, is inevitably going to be limited. It's going to be limited specifically to the people who are first and foremost geographically close to the institutions out of which this state exerts its power, the cities. In the countryside, the majority of the French nation maybe, they are going to be excluded by these institutions. Not Not because the institutions don't want them, but because the institutions are materially limited in their ability to encompass all of the people in the polity over which it has dominion. Okay? So, institutions of the state that, I'm going to use an Althusserian word, that interpolate people as citizens, equal citizens, are materially definite and therefore finite and limited. The polity, right, even within a nation, is going to be limited in regards to its material foundation in the people. You have the majority of the people, and you have institutions that interpolate the people as equal citizens. But these institutions are materially limited and definite. They're finite. They're not inevitably going to encompass everyone. There's aspects of the people that it necessarily is going to not be able to take into account, because the people are infinite. The people are material. They're infinite in a sense, right? They're the very foundation of these institutions. The institutions are finite. Do you guys follow me on this so far? The first one I think you understand, which is that there are different states and there are different polities. That's the first mistake Marxists overlook. There's different states and there's different polities. But even within the states and the polities, the way in which institutions make their people universal and equal citizens is limited. My last sentence was that there are two reasons why the Western Marxist view of class is flawed. The two reasons are simple. As we've already said, the presupposition of class, the essence of class, is formal political equality, where everyone is an equal on the marketplace. Only after this does the paradox of class arise. Why? Because some people are selling goods, whereas other people are selling what is abstractly defined as the source of the goods themselves, labor. Paradoxically, labor is treated as just another good, even though it's the source of all goods in the first place. I want you guys to think about this in the contemporary context. In America specifically, why is there a distinction between cities and the countryside, what's called the countryside? Is it because there's something specific about agriculture? Well, maybe. But in the United States and many other countries, and also, this is another important thing, countries where the rural countryside is formed by nomads who are not agricultural laborers, and that was also true historically, the rural is not really defined by agriculture. The rural is actually defined by the place that is outside of these materially limited and finite institutions that make all of us equal, formally equal, or at least formally recognized in some way. Okay? The reason cities contrast so much with the countryside is because in cities, right, the institutions, geographically, this is what I'm saying, the internet actually complicates this in really interesting ways. But geographically speaking, the reason cities are so different from countryside is because within cities, the institutions that give recognition to us as formally equal that's the center of those institutions. So that's where those institutions are able to immediately exert the power. So that's why cities are bubbles, they're echo chambers, they're safe spaces. That's why institutions in America are the same way, especially institutions, materially limited institutions. Yeah, the point we were trying to say, Jennifer, but we were speaking in the 19th century context, I kind of fast forwarded applying it to America today, is that every type of polity, and the word polity just means a more general word for a state. I don't like the word state because I think it's too specific. I like the word polity. A polity just refers to some type of political dominion that encompasses people, basically. But every polity is finite and therefore materially limited. A polity also has material premises. But Marxists never have given recognition in the West to the material premise of a polity itself. And in fact, formally speaking, Mao Zedong was the first Marxist that I know of, at least, who gave recognition to the polity as actually something materially definite. That's the whole point of Mao's encircling the cities from the countryside. And that's the whole reason why Mao had three worlds theory and all those kinds of stuff in the first place. It's why Chinese Marxism is generally so much more advanced. But I'm not going to go off on it. The schizo side is coming, and I'm going off on a tangent about things. Let's just keep focused on where we are right now. In regards to this whole thing about the polity, okay? Okay, so the reason there's a distinction between cities and the countryside, you guys know why there's a distinction then? The reason is very simple, because the countryside just refers to the great majority of masses of people who are by default excluded from the state's institutions and the state's formal equality, not because the state is actively excluding them, but because there's aspects about the countryside that cannot be reined in or domesticated by the state or its institutions. There's aspects of these people in the countryside, their living being, their way of life, that resists this full domestication by the state that interpolates them as equal formal citizens, or just instantiated in institutions in general. Think about the coronavirus crisis. Now, I live in Michigan, not to dox myself. Yes, the hillbillies, exactly. Everyone knows that the countryside is more wild than cities. Countryside, people are less obedient to authorities than people in cities. In the countryside, people are more independent. They're more, they're more rebellious in general. I think on an intuitive level, I think we can all get that, right? The people who stormed the Capitol, that's another example. So that's what I mean by resistance. And think about the coronavirus also. The people least likely to follow the rules about coronavirus and most likely to not have a respect for the authorities are people in the countryside. I mean, just intuitively. I mean, factually, if it's true or not, just put that on the back burner. In our intuitions, we think this, right? And I think there's a reason why we think that always, right? Piggybacking off of that. The issue with Western Marxists is that the essence of class seems to be disclosed in these cities, because it's in cities that we are formally equal. Okay, what's up, Evan? Sorry, what's up, Evan? How you doing? Everybody? Say it straight. In cities, it's clear, right, that people are somehow much more formally equal in cities. People are more free in cities in the sense that in the countryside, you're weighed down by your traditions and your family and all these kinds of things. Or maybe you're a serf. Actually, historically, in the Middle Ages, you were a serf working in the countryside. If you escaped, you'd move to these cities, and that'd be a fresh start, right? So in a city, right, that's where actually people are interpolated. To use this heavy Althusserian word, which I can explain, it basically just means branded, if you will, by the state as formally equal citizens, Republican equality, right? Who enter into relationships on a contractual basis, on a fresh basis. They don't enter into relationships based on tradition. They enter into relationships on a fresh basis, and the only way to validate whether those relationships are voluntary or not is through contracts. And now in the West, you're seeing a tendency, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but you're seeing a tendency in which everything seems to be contractual. And this is really the decline of liberalism. I've seen people who say that a baby needs to give consent to change its diaper. It needs to sign a contract for its diaper to be changed. Because changing the baby's diaper is a violation. So Marxists make the mistake that, so they observe correctly, they observe that in the cities, that is actually where class is being revealed. Because in cities, that is actually where people are formally equal citizens entering into relationships based on contractual and formally free association. Okay? But Marxists make a fatal and idealist mistake. Intellectual types tend to have chauvinistic tendencies toward country people. I know, but Leonardo, for so long, they've justified it theoretically. And I'm here now to really lay it down why they're wrong theoretically and why actually it's a complete betrayal of Marxism. We know intuitively, I think, all of us know intuitively that countryside is more revolutionary than cities. We know intuitively that peasants are more revolutionary than intellectuals. We know intellectuals are basically counter-revolutionary, petit bourgeois, and so on, but we've only been able to rely on our intuitions. We have these Marxist nerds who come to us acting as priests, telling us that on this theoretical level, ultimately, despite our intuitions, Marx disagrees with us. We're wrong in terms of Marxism theoretically, our intuitions. So I'm here to really try to explain to you guys, even though you might already have the intuition, why this is theoretically true as well. And all of, obviously, these people on BreadTube, and unfortunately even some Marxist-Leninists, they're also reproducing this problem of this kind of misinterpretation of Marxism that comes from the West. Okay? So what follows from this is basically that this is why initially Marx and Engels committed the error, and I can say it was an error because they themselves would admit to this fact later in their lives. And if they didn't admit it explicitly and say the words, "this was an error," they admitted it in practice by denouncing it and disagreeing with it later in life. Which is this idea that the communist revolution or the proletarian revolution is going to occur in the more advanced polity. The logical consequence, not only of it occurring in the more advanced polity, is also that it will occur in the cities of that polity rather than the countryside. So you see, it's a double error. It's a logical conclusion. First, you say the backward places are not advanced enough. It's going to have to happen in the advanced countries. Then you say, even in those advanced countries, it's going to happen in the enlightened cities where everyone is politically, formally equal, and the countryside is too backward. And this is a fatal double error. And this error actually can't account. But I don't think Marx was wrong, because I think Marxists have made an assumption about Marx on his position. They made the assumption of stagism. They took for granted the fact that actually Marx was always a dialectician. Marx always thought about this dialectically. And that's why if you look at his analysis of the French, of the 18th Brumaire, right, and the Civil War in France and other works, Marx makes it very clear that the French Revolution, the new French Revolution, requires an alliance between the city proletariat, the people who would carry out the Paris Commune, and the majority, the great majority of the French people, to lead a people's revolution. Because the error Western Marxists have made, drawing from Anglo-Saxon metaphysics, was this idea that this is all occurring chronologically in time, okay? Sequentialism. First it's backward, and the backward evolves into the more advanced. But this is undialectical, because for a dialectical view, they exist simultaneously in time. There's not a temporal difference. And the Russian Social Democrats, as they were called in the beginning, engaged in a fierce debate about this. The economists of Russian social democracy said that Russia was too backward and that there shouldn't be any political revolution in Russia because there needs to be an economic transformation first. The Mensheviks were a little step below that, and they said there will be a political revolution which will be led by the big city liberal bourgeoisie. The Bolsheviks were the only ones to interpret Marx's class analysis as one that is simultaneous in time, meaning all of these things actually exist at the same time. It's not referring to some chronological Whig history of backward becoming more advanced. There's a dialectical insight that you have to derive from this that is now, that is in time. Interesting. But I think it's wrong to say that countries are too backward for revolution. And because the logical consequence of this in our own country is people like Vosh who are saying that people in the countryside are too backward and unenlightened, and that the people, liberals in the city who are enlightened, that's the actual source of leftist movements and socialism in the United States. And it's a fatal error. And if you think about this very practically in America, okay, the consequences of this error are what we see. Marxists in America are very arrogant intellectuals who look down upon the majority of the people in their own country. They think they're better than the majority of people in their own country. And they have this idea that the people in the cities, these institutionalized and over-socialized safe space type people that live in cities, are better than people in the country. And that's why they're kind of these Sam Cedar type, Poindexter, Nathan Robinson, Vosh, I don't care who you call them, these really nerdy, they have really nerdy demeanors. You have very few Marxists that have the demeanor of a good old communist as they were understood in the past. Somebody who was, more rough around the edges in their personality. Somebody who was, who wasn't so timid and so nerdy and, how can Vosh be a nerd when he doesn't even read or lies? Well, Jennifer, for me, a nerd is not someone who reads. A nerd is someone who uses the pretense of intellectual truth as a source of arrogance and a way to look down upon humanity. It's people who think that if you're book smart, it means you're street smart. But actually, people who are book smart are some of the most stupid people you could ever meet. Being street smart is way more important than being book smart. Countryside, if you guys can follow, the polity, the state, has to also be understood as definite and particular, and also materially limited. And the material foundation of the state, the polity, lies in the countryside. That's why we see the distinctions that we do between the city and the countryside. And Marxists have always made the mistake of thinking that because the essence of class reveals itself in the cities, that is actually the site of the class struggle. But they don't understand. They mistaken the site of a revelation of appearance with the site of being, of actual existence. Okay? It may be true that the proletariat emerges in cities, but all that does is tell us something about the being. But it doesn't actually mean it's the same thing as being itself. That's why peasants have more revolutionary potential, ultimately. Well, it's not that they have more revolutionary potential, because when states are overthrown, it tends to happen from cities. But think about Mao encircling the cities from the countryside. It's not always the case. Not to suck you off, but the stuff you are saying is what I've been thinking for years. This is spot on. Really glad to hear that No More Libs. Yeah, and we don't see it as you sucking us off at all. We believe you, okay? Because we know that intuitively a lot of people really feel this way. But we have a lot of these fake Marxists who are coming here and saying, no, your intuition is wrong. Actually, according to Marxism, the more advanced city proletariat is better than the backward countryside. And we're trying to demonstrate how, from a theoretical Marxist perspective, this is a gross distortion of Marx that has its origin in Western Marxism. I would say this. The class struggle, the essence of class struggle, is revealed to us first in the advanced countries, in England and in cities. But it's a canary in the coal mine. It's only revealed there. It reveals something about being. The real stakes of this class struggle is always going to be about the majority of the people who are excluded from the institutional equality that is the very premise of this apparent class struggle that's going on in the cities. And this revolution is not just about the injustice of an inequality. The revolution, the objectivity of social revolution, basically lies in this simple fact. Institutions are materially limited. States are materially limited. Not only are they materially limited by the countryside being the foundation, but they inevitably enter into contradiction with their premises merely by the confrontation itself. When the state confronts the countryside, when the polity confronts the countryside, its own material foundation, this inevitably gives rise to a conflict because there's an aspect of the countryside that is not able to be domesticated by the state or the polity. And the polity responds to this fact by basically crucifying the people, the countryside, by basically, it's almost in an exterminationist way. And it's not only, obviously this isn't only internal to a polity, it's also true for the relationship between different polities and nations. I mean, we know this, the quintessential example of this is colonialism and imperialism. I think all Marxist-Leninists understand what I mean when I say it in that way. But that almost, not in terms of the severity and brutality, but structurally speaking, the same relationship is also going on internally with the countryside of these own countries. And the reason is very simple. The material foundation of the polity lies in the countryside. But the polity does not accept its own material foundation. We cannot actually make the error of just saying, so it's the peasants versus the city and that's it. Because the peasants are what gives rise to the city itself. Cities come from the countryside, guys. Cities basically form when people run away from the countryside, and it's inevitable. So the real stakes of Marxism or communism or whatever you want to call it doesn't lie in just siding with the countryside against the cities. I mean, that's a materialistic instinct you should have. Yes, the material foundation is the countryside. But the real significance of Marxism, because that's nothing new, guys. I mean, populism has always been inevitable. Jimmy Dore is speaking to something without ever having to even think about Marxism. So is maybe Alex Jones, and maybe Donald Trump was doing that too. They didn't have to think about Marxism, and yet this objective social contradiction is revealing itself. No, in fact, the real significance of Marxism is basically lies in the aftermath. The real significance of Marxism is basically the aftermath of this social revolution, where institutions will inevitably be more amicable and more encompassing of the people over whom they exercise dominion. A good example of this happened actually during the New Deal. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who did he appoint as his secretaries and his cabinet? He appointed country folk from Texas and wherever else, these simple people into government. He wanted these people. The reason he wanted these people is because the New Deal corresponded to an objective social revolution that expanded America's state and institutions to encompass and reflect more of its people than it did before. Okay? That's kind of almost something that's inevitable, but the real significance of Marxists is to assume leadership over this inevitable social revolution. The real significance of Marxists is to say, yes, we are with the peasants against the country, but a transformation does inevitably await the peasants, and the peasants must prepare themselves for the inevitability of change. We don't even know what that change will necessarily look like. It's just that what's revealed in the cities shows us Marxists that there is a fundamental class antagonism. That's why even if we make all of us formally equal to try to bridge the gap between town and country, there's still going to be a class contradiction. And that's what Marxists are here for. They're here to lead the people through this contradiction. The most popular politician that brought up class issues in America came out of Vermont. I mean, exactly. And we've been seeing this. I mean, guys, it's ridiculous, because the reason we have rule-minded leftists isn't because they arrived at it theoretically. It's just it's so self-evident that they couldn't even help just cave in and say, okay, yes. And it's the same for Marxism-Leninism. We don't have Marxist-Leninists because the majority of Western Marxist-Leninists have arrived at a consistent and coherent theoretical view of why Marxism is compatible with all of these experiences. It's just because of the fact it's so self-evident that why are these revolutions happening in the third world? Why are these revolutions happening in these anti-imperialist situations? And they have to cave in and just call a spade and accept the fact. But they haven't actually reconciled their intuitions with Marxism at this more fundamental theoretical level. I think what maybe might distinguish us, but we don't want to knock on an open door, is that we are reconciling Marxism-Leninism with traditional, real classical Marxism of Marx and Engels. There is nothing inconsistent about the experience of Marxism-Leninism with the most original discovery of Marx himself. It's completely consistent. Would also be fair to say that in an advanced country like the United States, inner cities and ghettos can play a similar role to the countryside. Malik, that's an excellent point. That's true, but for black people. Black people are also divided between metropolitan and countryside, and inner cities and ghettos do serve as the kind of countryside of the black community. But that actually is something internal to black people. It's not the business, I don't think, of white communists to try to assume leadership of the black masses. It's the business of black people. Like I said, there's contradictions in polities. There's contradictions in nations. That's why intersectionality is wrong. We cannot assume an intersectional position. We can only focus on our own people, on our own polity, okay? We can't be intersectional. You know, I can't account for people... I can't account for people living in Indonesia, okay? I just can't. I can only focus on my own people. I can try to fight against my state trying to bother them, and I can work with the people of Indonesia on a mutual dialogue basis, but I can't actually intersectionally account for every... you know what I'm saying? That's why intersectionality is wrong. Peace USA...